Hi everyone, welcome to CMN 201. This is for our class for Wednesday, September 14th. And I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the readings that I had assigned for this week from the text Projected Fears. I wanted you to read the introduction. I'm hopeful that you had a chance to do that. From the text Horror Film, the fourth chapter, What is Horror? The fifth chapter, The Why of Horror, and the sixth chapter, Critics and Censors of Horror. And I also wanted us to watch a documentary that I think serves as a good foundation for what we will be doing this semester, entitled Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue, which is also the name of one of the texts that I've assigned for the class. So this is the video version of the text. I also wanted to talk a little bit about film viewings because I would have sent you an email about an expressed interest in having informal film viewings. Unfortunately, the person who expressed the interest in putting together an informal viewing group was not able to remain in the class. So this person is hoping to take the class in the spring, which is when I'm going to be offering it as a face-to-face class because they very much wanted to have in-person dialogue. That said, if you think that this is an idea that you want to pursue, please let me know, and I will put you in contact with others who also are interested in trying to set up a time sometime during the week to watch these films in person and have some conversations in person if you wanted to have a kind of study group about them. Now, I had indicated that some of these films may not be available for free online. I will offer you as many links as possible for these films that I can find for their availability for free streaming. I will also put these films on reserve in the GCC library so that you can watch the DVD version. You can't take it out of the library, but you can watch it in the library. And of course, you can always elect, if the film is not available for free streaming, to rent or purchase the film on your own. It's probably going to become more of an issue as the semester progresses and we start to get into copyrighted films, something that we don't really have to worry about very much at the beginning of the semester. So I wanted to talk a little bit about Projected Fears and their introduction. And they talked a little bit about popular culture. So culture is basically any group membership. And it's oftentimes defined by large cultural groups, such as those based on ethnicity, for instance, or gender, for instance, or age, for instance. But basically, any group membership class is qualified as a culture because there's shared beliefs and values and attitudes and behaviors that are associated with that group. Of course, we don't want to stereotype and assume that everyone in the group is exactly the same way. But there's a predictive element so that if you belong to a particular cultural group, the assumption is that there are certain values or behaviors or beliefs or attitudes that probably are shared by the majority. And when we talk about popular culture, we're talking about that which is mainstream and wide. In other words, a cultural group that is very large, the masses, in effect. And that's where basically media and popular culture studies come to play, and that we begin to study those elements that the masses embrace, things like film, for instance, and talk about how that reflects our society. Now, these particular films that we are going to talk about with horror film have oftentimes achieved this mainstream U.S. cultural immortality. So take a film like Dracula, for instance. So whether or not you've seen the Bela Lugosi version of Dracula, my suspicion is that you are aware of the Bela Lugosi version of Dracula, which has become iconic, right down to the Lugosi accent that we'll talk about when we get to that particular film. The way that I wanted us to examine these films was more than just for profit, or more than just for entertainment or escapism, and more for just, and instead of that, thinking about their representational, their allegorical, their abstract, their suggested meanings. Because these films are usually created for profit, which is why they are primarily for entertainment. But that doesn't mean that something that's created for profit or for entertainment cannot also be read from an academic perspective, which is what we are going to be doing over the course of the semester with these particular films. And I would argue that these films oftentimes show us our collective fears, the fears we have as groups of individuals in our cultures, the anxieties we have in our cultures. In fact, the way I've divided the films up by a decade perspective, I would argue that they show the fears of each generation. And that, yes, there is a certain level of familiarity because horror film follows a genre. And a genre is a category. There's certain characteristics that you can't anticipate to find. But that said, I think these films also offer creativity and also offer a certain lens into depth and sophistication, which is why they're worthy of our particular study. So, in terms of thinking about what is horror, which I had assigned from the Reading Horror Film on Chapter 4. And keep in mind that these texts are also on reserve in the GCC library if you don't yet have access to the textbook. Talks a little bit about how genres or categories can blend and that what we call horror can sometimes be viewed as science fiction. Frankenstein is a wonderful example of that. And the idea of horror or supernatural is that which defies the natural order, that which cannot be explained scientifically, as opposed to science fiction, which is something that could be explained through the lens of science. The science just hasn't progressed enough to get us to that particular point, which is why science fiction is oftentimes placed in the future. Or think about even fantasy, and sometimes a movie or a text can straddle all three. The idea behind fantasy is that it's set in an unrealistic world, as opposed to what we oftentimes find with horror films. We're in a realistic world with an unrealistic element associated with it. Again, supernatural, that's which would defy the natural order, as opposed to science fiction. But famous texts oftentimes can be pieces of all three. So some of the elements you can expect to find in horror and horror film. Monstrosity, and actually that comes from the Latin word monstrare, which means to show or to reveal. And I would argue that these texts show and reveal a great deal about ourselves and others. Expect fear, anxiety, the threatening of normalcy and the moral order. One of my favorite quotes happens to come from I Am Legend by Richard Matheson, if you're familiar with that text. And the quote is that normalcy is a majority concept. Normalcy is a majority concept. And I love this quote because I think it does a fantastic job of sort of illustrating how basically the cultural group, the majority, determines what we consider to be normal or abnormal, since horror film oftentimes delves into the abnormal. A figure under threat, usually female, and the female is oftentimes quite passive, and we will definitely see that in early horror films. Possible supernatural, so there is also the possibility of an ambiguity, so that if you're not willing to accept the supernatural definition, you can accept another definition, something like madness, for instance, or insanity. And I'm not sure which is more horrific. Is it the external monstrosity or the internal monstrosity within ourselves, our own inner demons that we struggle with as we grapple with sanity and insanity? Eerie atmosphere. The atmosphere is so important. And I also teach a class in Gothic literature, and we talk about the first Gothic novel, The Castle of Otranto by Horace Walpole, written in Britain, and that this helped to establish some of the conventions of the Gothic, including that eerie atmosphere, where you would have a haunted castle, and you would have shadows and trapdoors and things of that nature. And I oftentimes liken it to the sort of atmosphere that we expect with Halloween, that comes as well with certain expectations about darkness and what's eerie. And then also a sense of doubling. You might have heard this term in terms of doppelganger, the idea that we've all got a double, and that the double can represent light and dark. One of us can be a light side and the other side can be a dark side. I mean, it sounds very Freudian if you know something about the id, the ego, and the superego, where the idea behind the ego is sort of the balance, the two sides of our personality. But Outside of the psychological, there is a long tradition of discussion within the supernatural realm about this idea of doubling, even tripling. If you're familiar with the filmmaker Jordan Peele, it's something that he examines in his film Us, by the way. Hopefully I'm not giving away too many spoilers there. And then the third chapter, or the third element that I wanted you to consider, and note that I've included the notes below these videos so that you can see these are my notes that I'm working off of. The why of horror. Why is it that someone would want to engage in something that brings about fear and anxiety? Lots of theories associated with that. It could be the release of endorphins, which can be quite pleasurable. It could also be catharsis, which is a Greek term, which is a purging of emotion, which explains why it oftentimes feels pleasurable to see something like a sad movie and to cry, because we get to experience the emotion and purge it and continue on, but do so in a safe way, because you know that what you are lamenting is not real. It's a group of actors. And if it were real, then the experience would no longer be pleasurable. It would be very similar to riding the roller coaster in the amusement park. Again, perhaps to have the release of endorphins and, the excitement that can occur. And it's exciting because, again, you're riding that roller coaster in a safe situation. If this were happening in your car, I don't think you would feel any kind of pleasure. But again, there are individuals who enjoy this sort of thing, and I'm hopeful that that is our class, that's why you signed up for this class. So I oftentimes tell students, you need to have the right temperament to take this particular class. If you're going to have nightmares because we are watching scary movies, then this is probably not the class for you. Instead, I usually end up getting students to say, just bring it on, and as many of you indicated in your introductions that you are fans of horror film. So, but again, horror film is meant for entertainment and escapism, so probably we have never really studied it from an academic perspective, which is what we are going to try to do this semester. Now, Stephen King, a name you might be very familiar with in the Gothic tradition and also in horror films. And he is best known as a novelist, but he also wrote a text called Danse Macabre, which means basically the dance with death. And what he does in that text is that he examines the history of horror, both in film and in text and in audio. And his argument is that the reason why individuals are attracted to this particular genre is because it allows them to engage in deviance, something that's considered taboo in our society. And then we return to the status quo. So this is a way that we can perhaps, experiment and expand our boundaries. But at least according to King, horror films and horror texts are quite conservative, because in the end we usually return to a sense of normalcy, what the majority culture considers normalcy. Now, there have been other critics who have talked a little bit about why individuals are interested in horror, or some of the ways that one could go about analyzing horror from an academic perspective. One of the most famous is named Robin Wood. And he has a very famous essay called An Introduction to Horror Film, where he talks about that which is psychologically repressed, that which is considered other, different from ourselves, is that which is what we fear most. And that's what these horror films examine, that which is other, that which is different from ourselves, that we are psychologically repressing. Sigmund Freud, and if we wanted to talk about psychology, has a very famous essay called The Uncanny, and where he talks about fright bringing back that which is repressed, old and familiar, and the familiar and strange, and that this goes all the way back to our hunter and gatherer days, with our primitive primordial fears of things like the dark, because of the unknown that's associated with the dark. Julia Kristeva, another critic, a more contemporary critic, talked a little bit about body fluids and how oftentimes body excretions are elements that we find in horror film. Stephen King calls this the gross out, and that this is an attempt to basically horrify the audience by grossing them out. Julia Kristeva talks about how these excretions are both elements of self and also elements of other, that they are part of ourselves, but they are not supposed to be on the outside. They're supposed to be on the inside, which is why we feel a sense of revulsion when we see bodily fluids, such as blood or urine, in a horror film. Barbara Creed, another contemporary critic, talks about the idea of female monstrosity, and that how oftentimes the female is presented in a negative light in the world of the Gothic because of the fear of female by society. Another critic by the name of Carol Clover, who's quite famous for her theory that you might have heard of, called The Final Girl. And this is perhaps best referenced in a movie such as Halloween, which we will be talking about as the semester progresses. That particularly in the slasher film movement, what we usually have is a final girl, a female who survives. So we see a certain level of strength and ability. However, that female is also subjected to brutality and horrors. So it's a complicated view of female because female is tortured. And that this final girl, this phallic survivor, in effect, is a survivor because usually the final girl is presented as the ideal female in society, someone who is virginal and motherly. And again, that's very much illustrated by something like Halloween. And in fact, this has become such a trope now that you can almost expect that the sexually promiscuous teenagers are going to be the first to die in a horror film, and it's the virginal teenager who will basically live until the end. And yes, teenagers are oftentimes attracted to horror film. I know that teenagers oftentimes are attracted to taboos. It's the time in life when you are breaking taboos and you're trying to establish a certain level of independence. And I think because of that, horror film is oftentimes maligned and misunderstood. You know, that it's viewed as vulgar or immoral or crass or violent. And certainly it can have those elements, but it can also be a reflection of our time. So the documentary that I wanted you to watch, it's approximately an hour and a half long, an hour and 36 minutes actually to be exact, entitled Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue. It came out in 2009, and it gives you an overview of some of the elements of the horror tradition, at least in Western culture. So this is the culture we're going to be focusing on. This is a pretty broad subject, and we could talk about horror from lots of other cultural perspectives, but we're going to focus on the United States. And this is where ultimately we get to talk about horror film after we've got this sense of introduction, which is what we are doing next week by watching and ultimately discussing what's considered to be the first feature-length horror film, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which is referenced somewhat in Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue, but I wanted us to see the film in its entirety, to talk a little bit about its importance. The readings that I've assigned to go along with that are The Origins of Film Gothic in the text Nightmares, Genreification in the text horror film. It's also an opportunity for us to talk about writing journals. If you remember, what I want us to begin doing, starting with The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, is writing an informal response to each of the films that we are going to be watching. And I'm thinking approximately a page or so of reflection, but as long or as short as it needs to be. And I'm grading it informally, just for content, not for grammar or for mechanics, which means I'm also using an informal grading system of a checkmark scale, with a plus being excellent, a check plus being very good, a check being satisfactory, and so forth. And I think of it as a conversation on paper, since I'm not grading for grammar or mechanics. And certainly you can write more than a page or so, but a page would be, let's say, a nice ballpark for you to begin to write thoughts or reflections or questions. And sometimes the questions are a lot more interesting than the answers. So as you are watching the films, I encourage you to take notes, because those are things that you can incorporate into your journals. You can also utilize information from our class readings, our class videos, and also our class discussion questions as well. So As I indicated, you'll be doing this for each of the films we'll be watching. So by the ending of the semester, you will have journal commentary on all of the major films in the Gothic tradition that we will be examining over the course of the semester. This will be very helpful for something like a final examination. Our final will be an essay exam, and it will be open book, open notes, which means that you can reference all of your journals. The journals can also be quite helpful with establishing a final project. And I'll talk a little bit more about the final project as the semester progresses, but basically you can begin thinking now about the idea of the final project, that you get to pursue something in depth. Now, I've certainly chosen films, and you can choose one of those films and write a more in-depth, pretty typical academic analysis of several pages in length. You might decide to talk about a film that we haven't covered in class. You might decide to talk about something that is a little bit more creative. So you might want to create your own film and talk about it in class. As I said, I will give you suggestions and ideas as the semester progresses. But now that we are transitioning away from the introduction, which is what today is, and our documentary, next week we begin, as far as I'm concerned, the actual class itself by watching the horror films and talking about their commentary and their importance. So for today's discussion forum question, remember I told you that what I'm doing is putting a discussion forum question that serves as your attendance for that particular class. So your response is not evaluated in any way. It's just merely used as an indicator for your being present, in effect. And you're not required to respond to the responses of your classmates, but you are required to read the responses of your classmates and my responses as well, because I will respond to all of you. What I'm trying to do is to mimic what we would do in a class discussion. So in a class discussion, you could think about your response in the discussion forum as if you had raised your hand and you had contributed something. And certainly if you wanted to respond to your peers, it would be very similar if someone else had said something in class and you wanted to piggyback off of that. Again, you're not required to respond to other individuals, but you are required to read everyone's responses and my responses. I will read all of your responses and write responses in turn, much as I did with your introductions last class. So for today's discussion forum, and that will be due Friday the 16th at 6 p.m. Now, keep in mind that we're going to be watching films. I've given you a 48-hour period. If that turns out to be something that's not realistic, certainly I can give you an extension. But what I was hoping is that if we could all watch these films within a 48-hour period and then give discussion forum responses, we could have those ready to read before we read the next set of selected readings and before we get ready to view the next film. So, but again, if it turns out that you needed additional time, just let me know and I'll be happy to grant you an extension. So let's aim for Friday the 16th at 6 p.m. And the question is going to be on the documentary that I'm going to ask you to watch on Nightmares in Red, White, and Blue. What do you think, or what did you think, was one of the most interesting things in the documentary Nightmares Red, White, and Blue, and why? And as you can note, there really is no right or wrong answer to this. I'm more interested in your thinking and your thought process. So I will leave you to watch the documentary. I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next week talking about the very famous Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Take care. Bye-bye.